Billionaire took her daughter to dinner. Then he saw a black maid and did the unbelievable. On a quiet Saturday morning at the corner of downtown Asheville, North Carolina, inside the cozy walls of Bluebird Café, a wealthy CEO sat sharing breakfast with his young daughter when a woman and her son quietly stepped through the door. They chose the furthest table, settling into the shadows as if to disturb no one, and asked gently for a single glass of water to share. They looked weary, worn thin by life, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't just settle into the body but the soul. The little girl turned to her father, her voice soft but certain, and asked, "Can we share our breakfast with them?" And so began a morning unlike any other. Rick Mallory, a man of 50 years dressed in a light blue flannel shirt with sleeves rolled up and silver beginning to thread through his neatly kept hair, sat with his 8-year-old daughter Chloe in that sun-drenched cafe, the air thick with the comforting scents of coffee and warm waffles. Bluebird Café was no ordinary diner. It was a beloved local spot where no one asked what you did for a living. Whether you were a company boss or someone sweeping floors at the bus station here, you were just another neighbor torquated with the same smile and a hot cup of coffee. Chloe, with her soft floral dress and brown hair, tied a little off-center, swung her feet beneath the booth and fiddled with a silver spoon, the very picture of an untouched childhood. For Rick, these Saturday breakfasts had become a quiet ritual, a sacred moment carved from the noise of corporate life, especially since the loss of his wife 3 years earlier. The world he knew during the week was filled with hard deadlines, high-stakes meetings, and lifeless numbers. But these mornings with Chloe belonged to a gentler rhythm. As he turned the pages of the menu, and Chloe animatedly recounted a dream she had the night before, the bell above the door rang softly. In walked a black woman in a faded coat, dust clinging to the fabric like a memory of long walks and longer nights. Her face showed deep fatigue, the kind that sleep no longer cures, and by her side a thin boy of about 7 clung to her hand. His wide eyes scanned the room, cautiously alert, protective, even in his smallness. Rick looked up instinctively. So did Chloe. They watched silently as the woman and child took a seat against the wall, moving as though afraid the world might shatter beneath their weight. When the waitress approached, the woman whispered a simple request. "Just a glass of water, please?" The waitress paused for a moment, then nodded quietly, pulling a pen from the pocket of her apron. Chloe tilted her head and watched with wide eyes, then tugged gently on her father's sleeve and whispered, "Daddy, they didn't order food." Rick nodded slightly, not yet speaking, but Chloe continued, her voice even softer, but with a quiet insistence. "Can we share our breakfast with them?" Rick turned to look at his daughter, not surprised by the words, but struck by her expression. In her eyes there was no pity, no uncertainty, only pure, unfiltered concern. He had seen that look before, long ago, in the eyes of his late wife, when kindness still came effortlessly and without reason. His heart ached quietly, then softened. He nodded. Across the room, the boy stared intently at a faded menu taped to the wall where a picture of syrup-drenched waffles and bright red strawberries hung. His eyes lit up not just with hunger, but with hope, the kind that tries to imagine taste through memory. His mother sat quietly, fingers laced together, her gaze lost somewhere far beyond the walls of that cafe. Outside, the morning sun filtered gently through the trees, casting shifting patterns of light on the red-brown tiled floor. No one else in the cafe seemed to notice them, but Rick and Chloe did. At their table, a steaming plate of waffles had just been set down. Chloe pushed one piece gently toward the edge of the plate, then looked up at her father. He rested a hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with both warmth and resolve. There was something in that moment, hushed yet powerful, like the soft opening of a door between strangers. And from the simple question of a child, a story quietly began to unfold. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the beginning of this story. If you felt even the slightest stir in your heart from this quiet yet deeply meaningful act of kindness, we invite you to help us share more stories that touch the soul. Please consider subscribing to our channel, liking this video, and sharing it with someone you care about. Emotional Echoes is dedicated to bringing you everyday stories full of humanity, moments that might make you smile, bring a tear to your eye, or simply warm your heart in the midst of a world that often feels uncertain and ever-changing. Where are you listening from today? Leave us a comment below and let us know where this story found you. By doing so, the emotions we feel together won't remain in one quiet corner, but can travel far and wide across the country and perhaps even beyond those invisible borders that separate us. And now we invite you to continue with the next part of the story. Rick cut a piece of waffle and brought it to his lips, but he didn't eat. Instead, he looked at his daughter, then glanced once more toward the table across the room. The waitress had just returned, placing a single glass of water in front of the black woman with a brief nod before walking away. Monica bowed her head in a whisper of thanks so soft it barely registered. Jaden held the glass with both hands, sipping carefully as if afraid that finishing it too quickly might mean there'd be nothing left. Rick felt a quiet pressure in his chest, something subtle but unmistakable. He had seen scenes like this from a distance on charts in conference rooms and policy meetings, where colored graphs and labels like low-income households floated abstractly across screens. But he had never really seen it not like this. Not a mother trying to preserve dignity in front of her child, not a child pretending not to be hungry. Chloe did not blink. She watched Jaden as if he were a boy from another world, her gaze steady, full of quiet curiosity. She pushed her own plate of waffles gently forward just a little closer to the edge of the table, then looked up again and whispered to her father, "Daddy, if they didn't order food because they don't have enough money, could we order more for them?" Rick met her eyes. There was no hesitation in her voice, no discomfort. For Chloe, helping was not something extraordinary. It was simply something one did. He nodded slowly, then raised his hand to catch the waitress's attention. When she returned, Rick spoke softly, his tone calm and low. "Could you bring the same breakfast we're having to that table over there, please? But don't tell them it's from me." The waitress paused, a brief flicker of surprise in her expression, then smiled and nodded her understanding. When the two hot plates were brought to the other table, Monica startled, lifting her head as if someone had made a mistake. Jaden looked at her, then at the food, his eyes wide and shining. Monica turned to the waitress, confused. "I'm sorry we didn't order these." The waitress smiled gently and, without offering an explanation, said, "This morning's special. Please enjoy." Monica looked as if she might ask something more, but instead she fell silent. She leaned toward Jaden, whispering something into his ear, but the boy couldn't resist. The smell of warm waffles, the melting butter, the shimmer of strawberry syrup on the plate, it was too much for an empty stomach to ignore. Monica picked up the knife and made the first cut, her hand trembling slightly, though she tried to keep her movements composed. Rick and Chloe didn't stare. They only glanced over now and then, just enough to see the two had begun to eat. Chloe smiled, her eyes lit up with a kind of quiet joy rarely seen so early in the morning. Rick took a sip of his coffee, its bold and slightly bitter taste somehow more comforting than usual. The cafe carried on around them, soft with motion and sound, customers coming and going, silverware clicking against plates, the espresso machine hissing in steady bursts. But in that one corner of the room, something else was happening, something no one else noticed except for the four souls caught in the quiet orbit of a small shared moment. When Jaden turned his head and looked toward Rick and Chloe's table, his eyes met Chloe's first. She smiled and gave a small wave. Jaden blinked, then waved back shyly. Monica saw the exchange and something in her gaze softened. Rick noticed it too and offered a slight nod, a silent greeting. A thread, invisible and fragile, began to stretch between the two tables. No words were needed, no explanations required. It was a moment quietly understood by both sides that regardless of who they were or what stations they occupied in the world outside, here and now, they were simply human beings sharing in a small act of kindness. Rick didn't know what would come after this breakfast, but something inside him was shifting. Maybe it wasn't something big or dramatic, but it was enough to ease something that had been tight in his chest for too long. Chloe held her fork and leaned close, whispering, "Did you see Daddy?" He smiled gently, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Yes, I saw. And I see you too. You're a pretty, wonderful little girl." Outside, the sun had risen higher, pouring its golden light down the peaceful street. But for the four people inside the Bluebird Café, that sunlight seemed to carry something more than warmth. It felt like grace. Not because of the weather, but because of something small and quiet that had just happened. Something that seemed unremarkable on the surface but reached into a deeper place in the heart. A single glass of water for two strangers, a plate of waffles shared, and a connection newly born in silence. As Jaden neared the end of his last piece of waffle, Rick saw the boy carefully trying to keep every drop of syrup from slipping off his plate. Monica had eaten only half of her meal, nudging the rest gently toward her son. Rick thought for a moment, then looked at Chloe. She seemed to understand his thoughts without a word, giving a small nod. Rick turned to the table across from them and offered a quiet smile before speaking in a calm, even voice. "I hope I'm not intruding. My name is Rick, and this is my daughter Chloe." Chloe lifted her hand in greeting, her eyes bright with a kind of happiness that only comes from doing something that matters. "Would you and your son like to sit with us? We come here most Saturday mornings, but it's not often we meet such lovely company." Monica paused. She looked at Rick, then at Chloe, then at her son. Jaden, holding his fork midair, glanced at their table and whispered softly, "Mama, can we?" Monica hesitated, maybe only for a few seconds, but in her heart time stretched out. She wasn't used to accepting invitations from strangers, especially not ones who clearly came from a different walk of life. But then she saw the look in her son's eyes, and she saw the sincerity in Rick's. Finally, she nodded and offered a quiet smile. "Thank you, if you truly don't mind." Rick shook his head. Not at all, quite the opposite. They moved to Rick and Chloe's table. Monica sat across from Rick. Jaden took the seat next to Chloe. At first, both mother and son were reserved. Monica sat upright, hands gently folded on her lap as if ready to leave at the first sign of discomfort. Jaden looked around the room, then back at the leftover waffle on Chloe's plate. Rick noticed and slowly pushed the dish toward the center of the table. The boy glanced up, his eyes asking a silent question. Chloe smiled. "Go ahead. Do you like it?" Jaden nodded eagerly. Monica looked at her son, then turned to Rick with a mix of gratitude and hesitation. "Truly, thank you both of you. Not everyone would be this kind." Rick's voice was low but warm. "I don't think it's about kindness. It's just what's right. Everyone deserves a decent breakfast. I'm just doing what any of us should do." Monica was quiet for a few seconds, then spoke gently. "My name is Monica. This is my son Jaden. We don't usually go out for breakfast. Today I had a job nearby and thought we'd stop in before I started." Rick nodded, his gaze steady and attentive. Monica didn't speak much, but there was something in her voice that carried more than words, a quiet exhaustion tucked neatly beneath a will that refused to break. He didn't ask anything more. At the other side of the table, Chloe was giggling with Jaden, telling him how she liked strawberry syrup better than honey. Jaden hesitated at first, but then began talking about the kind of waffles his mom made at home using their old oven. Two children from two entirely different worlds had found common ground in the simple sweetness of a shared taste. The conversation between the adults was still tentative, uncertain, like a bridge being tested for the first time, but the one between the children had already begun. Every now and then, Rick glanced at Monica and noticed the way she listened, fully present, carefully, with small nods and warm smiles. When Chloe spoke about school, Monica asked gentle questions that showed she was not just hearing, but truly caring. Rick had never seen anyone look so tired and still remain so soft in the way they spoke to a child who wasn't their own. He found himself wondering just how many times this woman had to hold herself upright, feign strength just so her son wouldn't worry. After nearly half an hour, Monica glanced at her watch. "I'm so sorry, I need to get to work now." Thank you, Chloe, truly. This morning was different." Rick stood up as she did. "It's nothing. If you and Jaden ever find yourselves free on another weekend morning, maybe we'll see you here again." Monica gave a faint smile. "Maybe, if we can afford more than a glass of water." Rick looked at her, his expression softening. "You don't need to order anything. We always seem to end up with more than we can eat." Monica smiled again, a small but real smile. Rick reached out his hand to shake hers. She took it, gave it a gentle squeeze. He and Chloe stood by the table watching the mother and son leave the cafe. Jaden turned back and waved. Chloe waved too, her face glowing. Rick looked at his daughter and saw an unforced joy on her face, a quiet lightness that made him realize something had shifted inside him, just a little. But it was enough. One table, two very different worlds. And yet today, that space between them had closed just a little. And for Rick, that felt like the beginning of something that mattered. As Monica stepped out of the Bluebird Café, her hand gripped Jaden's tightly as if holding on to the one thing anchoring her against the vast and shifting world. The early morning wind threaded its way through the brick-paved streets, slipping past the frayed edges of her worn coat. Jaden, still full of energy, talked excitedly about Chloe, about the best waffle he'd ever tasted, and the kind smile of the man he now knew as Mr. Rick. Monica smiled, nodded at all the right moments, but her mind was elsewhere in the shadows where worries lingered like a second skin. She was not someone used to accepting kindness. Life had taught her that nothing came without a cost. But something about this morning, something about that tiny cafe, had unsettled that lesson. Maybe not everyone used generosity as a disguise. Maybe there were still people who were kind without needing a reason. When they reached the small apartment on the eastern edge of the city where the walls were so thin you could hear the footsteps in the unit next door, Monica helped Jaden out of his shoes, hung their coats on a loose hook by the door, and hurried to change into her work uniform. Time was short. That morning she had been lucky enough to be offered an extra cleaning shift at an office downtown, a rare chance to gather a little more toward this month's electric bill. Jaden would stay with Miss Helen, the elderly neighbor, who sometimes looked after him when Monica couldn't. She knelt down, kissed his forehead. "I'll be back before dinner. Be good and listen to Miss Helen." "Okay." Jaden nodded, hugging her tightly. Monica held him close, just for a moment longer, as though this hug might have to last her all day. As though she needed its warmth to carry with her into the world outside, where the fight to survive never paused. On the crowded, noisy bus, Monica sat pressed against the window, her hand clutching a worn fabric bag that held her cleaning uniform, a pair of rubber gloves, and a bottle of water. She watched the blur of people outside, each moving quickly, chasing the rhythm of their own lives. No one knew that just last night she had sat up late counting every coin in her wallet, wondering how she could buy milk for Jaden and still afford bus fare for the rest of the week. No one knew she had once worked as a nurse at the local hospital until her mother fell gravely ill, and Monica had to take extended leave to care for her. When her mother passed, everything else unraveled. She lost her job, her home, and everything but her young son and an old car that hadn't been properly serviced in months. There was a time when Monica and Jaden had to sleep in that car for nearly a week. She remembered one night in particular when rain poured down in heavy sheets and leaked through a cracked window. Jaden curled up in her lap, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Mommy, do we not have a home anymore?" Monica had bitten her lip until it bled to keep from crying. She would not allow herself to break, not when her son was looking at her like she was the only thing left holding his world together. She took whatever work she could find, waiting tables, cleaning offices, babysitting, anything that would bring in enough to survive. Every dollar she earned was calculated with precision, spent on Jaden before she ever thought of herself. When Jaden came down with a high fever once, Monica stayed up all night pressing cool cloths to his skin and praying like she had never prayed before. With no health insurance, no doctor to call, all she had was a mother's love and a heart that refused to quit. When the bus finally stopped in front of the downtown office building, Monica rose to her feet, tightening her grip on the bag. The sun was high now, casting golden light across the stone-paved sidewalk. But all she saw was the long stretch of road ahead. She took a deep breath, pulled her collar up, and stepped into the new day as she did every day. This morning, she had eaten her fill. This morning, Jaden had smiled a wide, unguarded smile. And for Monica, that alone was enough to keep moving forward, even if no one else could see the weight she carried. In the eyes of the world, she was just a black woman mopping floors. But in the eyes of her son, she was everything. And in her heart, that love burned like a fire that would never go out, no matter how many doors the world tried to close. On a quiet Sunday morning, sunlight fell gently across the lush green grass of Riverside Park. The air was fresh, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and the soft chorus of birdsong. Rick sat on a wooden bench near the main path, a steaming cup of coffee warming his hands as his eyes followed Chloe skipping ahead with a bright red ball in her arms. Nearly a week had passed since that strange and unforgettable morning at the Bluebird Café, but the image of Monica and her little boy Jaden had not left Rick's mind. Since that day, Chloe had mentioned Jaden more than once, asking if they might see him again. Rick had hesitated, uncertain if reaching out would feel intrusive or worse, if it might put Monica in an uncomfortable position. But by Friday afternoon, he had found the courage to send a simple message to the number Monica had left behind when they parted ways. "Would you and Jaden like to join us at the park this Sunday? I thought the kids might enjoy it." He hadn't expected much. But to his quiet surprise, Monica had replied, saying that if it wasn't too much trouble, they'd be there. And now Rick waited, both slightly nervous and inexplicably lighthearted. Chloe ran up beside him, looking up with eyes full of hope. "Daddy, do you think they'll come?" Rick smiled, smoothing a hand over her hair. "I hope so." and as if summoned by the wish in his voice, he saw them, Monica and Jaden, appearing in the distance. Monica wore a simple white shirt, worn jeans, and a faded baseball cap that shaded her face. Jaden held her hand, his face lighting up the moment he spotted Chloe. Without a word, he let go and ran toward her. Chloe squealed in delight. In an instant, the two children fell into step beside each other, laughing, as if no time had passed between them at all. Rick stood and walked toward Monica with a quiet smile. "Good morning. Thank you for coming." Monica nodded. "Thank you for inviting us. Jaden's been asking about Chloe all week. I thought it'd be good for them to play." They chose a spot beneath a tall tree where the shade was wide and cool, and Rick laid out the checkered blanket he had brought along. He poured juice into small cups and shared a few cookies from a tin. Monica politely declined the snacks, but Rick, without pressing, gently placed a cup of juice beside her anyway. The children ran across the grassy clearing, chasing each other with the full, unburdened laughter only the young seemed to carry so easily. Monica sat quietly, her eyes following her son's every step, soaking in the sight of him, those small but vibrant strides that carried more life than the world had ever given him credit for. Rick glanced over at her and spoke in a voice that was soft, almost reflective. "He's a wonderful kid. You've done a great job raising him." Monica offered a quiet smile, one that didn't hide the weariness in her face. "I just try my best to make sure he never feels less than. The world out there isn't gentle with kids like Jaden. I can't change everything, but I can do whatever it takes to make sure he still believes in good things." Rick nodded, feeling the quiet conviction in her words. He understood that kind of quiet determination, though his own path had been different. After his wife passed, there were nights he truly believed he wouldn't be able to raise Chloe on his own. But then she showed him that sometimes simply being there, honest and steady, was enough to let something miraculous take root. Chloe used to cry at night, afraid to sleep alone. Used to ask questions about her mother he didn't know how to answer. And yet over time, through the rituals of showing up, of staying close, those wounds began to close. He could see that Monica was walking a similar path, though hers was paved with more obstacles, less comfort, and very few pauses to breathe. Chloe and Jaden came running back, cheeks flushed with sun and excitement. Chloe held a stem of wild grass, blowing the white tufts into the air as they floated like soft feathers against the blue. Jaden looked up, eyes tracking the drifting specks, then said in a quiet voice, "Mama, this is my happiest day." Monica pulled him close, her arms wrapping around him with quiet tenderness. Rick turned toward them, then back to Chloe. He didn't speak. He simply let the moment settle into his memory, letting its warmth take hold. There was nothing extraordinary about that Sunday at Riverside Park. Just the laughter of children, the soft rhythm of conversation beneath a tree, the quiet companionship of two people sitting near each other without needing to fill the silence. A few cookies, a red ball, a pair of gentle glances not yet defined by words. And yet it felt like something was beginning, something small but steady, like the first roots of a tree pressing into the soil. A friendship, a connection. And maybe, though none of them would dare to name it aloud, something deeper, something they all could feel quietly unfolding within them. A gentle midday breeze swept through the great oaks along the edge of Riverside Park, their leaves rustling like a soft melody, accompanying the first true conversation between two people who until now might have believed they belonged to different worlds. Rick and Monica sat side by side on a long wooden bench just a few steps from where the children played. Chloe and Jaden ran in circles around the little carousel near the center of the park, their laughter echoing across the green expanse. Rick watched his daughter with eyes softened by gratitude, then turned to Monica, his voice low and sincere. "Jaden's truly a kind boy. Chloe thinks the world of him." Monica smiled, her fingers gently laced together in her lap. "I think so too. I try to teach him to care, to be grateful. We don't have much, but I want him to know that kindness is never in short supply if we keep believing in it." Rick nodded, then fell silent for a few seconds before speaking again. "You're doing a remarkable job. Parenting alone isn't easy. I know that." Monica turned to him, a little surprised. "My wife passed away when Chloe was 5. A car accident, no one saw it coming." Rick's voice was calm, but he didn't meet Monica's eyes. His gaze drifted down to the ground as if staring into an old crack that still hadn't fully closed. Monica answered slowly, "I'm sorry to hear that." Rick gave a faint smile. "Thank you. It took me a long time to learn not to hide my feelings in front of her. At first I thought being strong meant showing nothing. I thought I was protecting her. But eventually I realized she didn't need a father made of stone. She needed a father who was real. Monica looked at him a moment longer than before. I understand that. After my mother died, I became a single mother too. No husband, no siblings. Just me and Jaden. I used to believe that if I never showed weakness, he wouldn't be afraid. But you can't hide everything forever. There were nights I cried in the bathroom. Jaden would knock and ask if my stomach hurt. I told him I was just sad from watching a sad movie. Her voice softened like a breeze brushing past old memories. Rick didn't interrupt. He simply listened with a silence that felt sincere and present. Monica went on. I used to be a nurse. Then my mother got very sick. I left work to care for her. There was no one else. When she passed, I tried to go back, but the position had already been filled. I don't blame anyone. It all just happened so fast. Then I lost my home. For a while, Jaden and I lived in our car. Rick tilted his head slightly, unable to hide the shock in his expression. Monica gave a dry smile, not bitter, just tired. I know I don't look like someone who once had a steady job, who once spent entire days and nights in the ER, but that was my life. Now I take whatever work I can find. As long as I can feed my son, that's all that matters. Rick nodded gently. Monica, you're stronger than you think. I mean that. Monica blinked at the words, slightly startled by the kindness, then shook her head softly. No, I'm not strong. I just didn't have a choice. Rick looked at her directly. But it's exactly that. The fact that you had no choice and still kept going, that's what makes you strong. Monica didn't answer right away. She turned her face, watching Jaden as he held out a hand to help Chloe down the slide. The two children laughed, their hands clasped as they took off running together like they'd known each other their whole lives. Monica clasped her own hands in her lap, then slowly turned back to Rick. You don't know how long I wrestled with myself before saying yes to today. I didn't want my son to see me get hurt. I didn't want to step into something new, only to have to explain to him again that the world isn't as kind as he hopes it is. Rick nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't try to soften it. I understand. And I'm not asking anything of you or Jaden. I just want you to know if you ever need someone to listen, I'll be here. Monica looked at him again, longer this time. The wind passed through the branches above, carrying with it the scent of old oak and soft sunshine. For the first time in months, Monica felt something inside her begin to ease, like the surface of a lake settling after a long, restless storm. She didn't know what would come next. But for now, today, she had sat beneath a tree with a stranger, and for a moment, she no longer felt completely alone. Sometimes that was all a guarded heart needed to begin opening even just a crack. On Monday morning, Rick returned to the high floors of his office, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of Asheville, awakening in the soft light of a new week. His calendar was packed, his assistant walking closely beside him, rattling off changes to the rollout of several new real estate projects. In the large conference room, a detailed zoning map lit up the screen displaying the redevelopment plans for an aging housing block in the city's eastern quarter. The Riverside commercial expansion had already been approved by the board, and all that remained was Rick's signature to authorize the first wave of rent increases, a carefully calculated move meant to clear space for larger investors. Rick sat still, staring at the cost projections before him. But in his mind, it wasn't numbers he saw. It was Monica's faint smile beneath the oak tree the day before, the way Jaden had held Chloe's hand as they raced across the park grass, his eyes lit with a joy that didn't yet know the shape of sorrow. Rick had always believed numbers were the one language he understood best, but today they felt cold. Too cold. He knew exactly what those rent increases would mean. That block of buildings was where families like Monica's were holding on barely. Raise the rent, and they'd be forced out. Everyone knew that. But they called it opportunity. They called it revitalization. They called it community renewal. Words dressed up in promise, but echoing now like justifications for the quiet, relentless shifting of modern urban life. Rick said nothing for the rest of the meeting. He signed the documents he had to, but when it came to the final authorization for the Riverside project, he left the folder untouched. His assistant noticed eyebrows raised slightly, but said nothing. Rick simply offered, "I need to review a few more details." That same afternoon, Monica returned home from an early cleaning shift at a luxury high-rise downtown. She stepped inside, washed her hands, and began preparing dinner for Jaden. He was sitting at the table, hair damp with sweat, after walking home from school, his workbook open in front of him. Monica looked at her son, and something in her chest tightened. Next week, the landlord was expected to announce changes to the lease. She had already heard whispers about an increase. The building they lived in, worn, aging, often overlooked, was on a list slated for redevelopment. A part of her wanted to believe they'd be offered relocation support, but life experience had taught her not to place faith in promises printed in ink. She hadn't asked Rick about his work. She'd never looked into what he actually did. Part of her didn't want to know. She had thought of their meeting as something rare, a temporary crossing between two lives that were never meant to intersect, a quiet and fleeting convergence of separate worlds. The next day, Monica reported for a last-minute shift at one of the penthouse developments nearing completion. She had been assigned to clean the top floor, the showcase unit prepared for a high-profile investor tour. As she stepped into the marble-tiled hallway, she felt out of place, a small figure swallowed by the silence and sheen of luxury. Head down, mop in hand, she moved carefully across the gleaming floor. Then, without warning, the elevator behind her opened with a soft chime. She looked up, and in that single moment, her entire body froze. Rick stepped out, flanked by two men in tailored suits and a woman in an elegant business outfit. He was mid-sentence, half smiling, half focused, until his eyes met hers. The room seemed to still. Monica tightened her grip on the mop handle, her face calm but unreadable. Rick's steps faltered, his body pausing in mid-motion. Monica said nothing. She gave a brief nod, then turned away and disappeared into the next room. The door closed slowly behind her. Rick stood there silent. One of the men beside him spoke up. "This is the model unit. It's just been completed, ideal for the upper middle market." Rick didn't respond right away. His mind was filled with the image of Monica in her work uniform standing in the quiet, sterile brightness of that hallway. Her expression had changed, no longer open, no longer soft. Her eyes had become a wall. The afternoon passed in a heavy blur. Monica finished her shift without a word. On the way home, she felt no anger toward Rick, no self-pity either, only clarity, a kind of sobering stillness. She and Rick came from two different worlds. One held the pen that signed off decisions that could take homes away from families. The other lived in fear of those very decisions. That line between them wasn't drawn by money. It was drawn by choice. And Monica had spent a lifetime learning what it meant to live without it. She exited the tower through the service route, passing through a dim, dusty garage. Her shoes picked up wet grime from the floor. The back of her uniform clung damp with sweat. Her hands still carried the chemical tang of glass cleaner. But what caught in her throat wasn't the smell nor the ache of a long shift. It was Rick's silence. That moment, his silence had said everything. She didn't know what she'd hoped for. Maybe just a simple hello, a flash of surprise, real and unguarded, or even just eye contact that didn't flinch. But what she received was hesitation, an awkward pause, as if she were something out of place, something that didn't belong in a setting of polish and prestige. She walked faster toward the bus stop, her chest heavy as stone. She wasn't angry, not in the way a child is when left out. She just felt herself returning to where she had always been, like an old wooden chair mistakenly placed in a showroom of modern glass and chrome. That evening, when Jaden asked if he could call Chloe, Monica simply shook her head. Her son didn't understand why, but he didn't press. He turned back to his comic book, sneaking quiet glances at her every now and then. Monica sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the small crack in the wall, her thoughts circling the sharp contrasts of her day. She remembered Rick's words in the park, that he understood what it meant to raise a child alone, that he respected her strength. But today, when he saw her kneeling over a cold marble floor, he said nothing. And for Monica, that silence spoke louder than any rejection. Because it wasn't the silence of a friend caught off guard. It was the silence of someone who had the power to move freely while she had to lower her eyes and keep cleaning. It wasn't just a pause. It was the boundary between the one who chooses and the one who survives. Meanwhile, Rick was no more at ease than Monica. After leaving the high-rise, he canceled his final meeting of the day and drove aimlessly through the streets of Asheville. He didn't take any calls, didn't respond to the board's messages, choosing instead to let his thoughts swirl unchecked in the silence of his car. He had seen Monica there, dressed in a simple janitor's uniform in a building he managed, in a space shaped by his decisions, where a signature from him could shift the lives of people like her without warning. He hadn't known she was working on that project, but what haunted him more than the surprise of seeing her was the weight of his own inaction. He could have stopped, said something, anything, just greeted her like someone he knew. But he had done nothing, and that silence, though brief, carried the heaviness of a wall erected between two people who had once shared something almost tender. Rick returned home long after sunset. Chloe was at the table working on her homework, and the moment she saw her father, she looked up eagerly. "Daddy, are we going to see Jaden and Miss Monica again this weekend?" Rick hesitated, then sat down beside her. I'm not sure, Chloe. She looked at him, her brow furrowed slightly. You didn't talk to her? Rick sighed, his gaze dropping to the floor. I did. But today, I did something I'm not proud of. Chloe didn't fully understand, but she said nothing. She simply placed her small hand over his. Rick gave her fingers a gentle squeeze, torn inside. He had always known how the world worked, how everything was layered, how people lived on different floors of the same city. He was used to being above the noise, deciding policies, shifting numbers, building and expanding. But today, for the first time, he had seen the face of someone whose home might vanish because of a choice he had the power to approve. And that face wasn't a stranger. It was Monica. That night, Monica couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring out into the dim courtyard behind her building, where neighborhood children sometimes played. A stray cat darted across the concrete under the yellow street lamp. The night air felt colder than usual. She had once believed that what existed between her and Rick was something real, but perhaps she had been wrong. A woman who scrubs floors and a man who signs contracts don't stay at the same table for long. They might share a few hours in the morning light beneath an oak tree. They might exchange glances filled with warmth, but reality would always pull them back to their original places. She had known that. She just hadn't expected the return to be so abrupt. Rick stared at his phone, where 3 messages still sat unread. The first, sent the night he saw Monica at the penthouse, was simple. I'm sorry if my presence today made you uncomfortable. I didn't know you were working there. The second, sent the next morning, asked gently if she and Jaden were doing all right. The third, 2 days later, was a quiet invitation. If you have time, Chloe and I would love to see you both at the park this weekend. All 3 messages remained unopened. Each one left a thin, cold silence beneath it. Rick had read and reread every word, careful not to write too much, not to pour out more than he should, not to beg. He knew Monica was proud. He respected that. But the long silence had started to feel like a kind of loss, one that came from somewhere deeper than disappointment. Something unfamiliar and unsettling for a man who was used to controlling outcomes. Chloe still asked about Jaden often. She drew pictures, cut and pasted magazine clippings into handmade cards, saying she would give them to him when they met again. Every time she did, Rick offered a strained smile, not wanting to dim her hope. Once she asked directly, "Daddy, did you do something to make Miss Monica upset?" Rick was quiet for a long time before answering. "I think I did, but I didn't mean to." Chloe didn't ask more. She simply folded her little cards carefully and tucked them into a box, as if trying to preserve something beautiful for someday. As for Monica, she had read the messages. She saw them appear one by one on her phone screen, each line tapping gently on a door she had only just closed. But she didn't respond, not out of anger, not out of resentment. She simply didn't know what to say. She didn't know if opening that door again would lead her back into something she wasn't sure she could hold. Because now things had become painfully clear in a way that left little room for hope. She and Rick came from 2 different worlds, and no matter how many times he reached out, that truth would not change. She remembered vividly how it felt to look up from the floor she was cleaning and see him in his tailored suit walking down the hallway flanked by executives. She didn't feel small because of her work. She felt small because in that moment the distance between them had taken shape. It was no longer invisible. It was real, sharp, and inescapable. She thought of Jaden, of his smile when he played with Chloe, of the lightness in his voice that rarely came. She didn't want to take that away from him, but she was afraid that Jaden would grow attached, that he would believe this world could be his only, to be quietly pushed out of it one day, reminded that it never truly belonged to him. Monica had once believed in opportunity, in kindness, but life had taught her that sometimes the good things, those quiet, gentle things, were best kept at arm's length, because from a distance they hurt less when they fall apart. The days that followed passed in quiet repetition. Rick kept working, fulfilling his role as CEO, making decisions, attending meetings. But each time he looked at the Riverside project report, the pride he once felt had faded into something hollow. Monica kept scrubbing the long, echoing hallways, cooking for Jaden, smiling at the elderly neighbor who helped her with childcare. But every night before bed, she picked up her phone, opened the message thread, and closed it again without typing a word. Between them now was a silence that neither knew how to bridge. The unanswered texts weren't just missed connections. They were long pauses in a song whose lyrics had never been finished. And sometimes it's not the words we say, but the ones we leave unsaid that echo the loudest, lingering, unresolved in the quiet that follows. On Saturday morning, a light rain fell steadily, soft and rhythmic, painting pale gray streaks across the sidewalk beneath the lingering glow of street lamps that hadn't yet shut off completely. Rick drove slowly through a narrow street on Asheville's east side where the buildings were old and weathered. On the back seat was a box of warm waffles and a small bouquet of simple white daisies wrapped in brown paper. Chloe sat beside him, holding tightly to Jaden's old fabric toy she had insisted on bringing along. She stared out the window, fingers nervously laced together, eyes full of quiet hope. Rick didn't know if Monica would open the door. He wasn't even sure he should be showing up at all. But after nearly a week of silence, after every unanswered message, he knew he couldn't just wait anymore. Some things had to be said face to face, even if forgiveness wasn't guaranteed. They pulled up in front of the aging building, its exterior marked by peeling paint and a wooden stairwell that creaked with every step. Rick asked Chloe gently to stay in the car for a moment, then stepped out into the rain-softened morning, waffles and flowers in hand. He walked to apartment number 12 and took a long breath before knocking 3 times. Footsteps echoed behind the door, slow, cautious. When it opened just a crack at first, Monica stood there still watching him. She didn't speak. Rick offered a faint smile and held up the bouquet. "I brought some waffles. Chloe says they're Jaden's favorite." Monica looked at him for a long moment, then opened the door wider. The smell of weak coffee and the faint dampness of old wood drifted from inside. Without a word, she stepped back to let him in. Jaden was sitting on the floor with a set of building blocks. When he saw Rick, his face lit up and he ran over, throwing his arms around him. "Uncle Rick, you really came." Rick crouched down, hugging him tightly, one hand gently ruffling the boy's hair. Outside, Chloe couldn't wait any longer. She opened the car door and ran in, and the 2 children fell into step like nothing had ever kept them apart. Monica moved to the kitchen and poured Rick a glass of water. He sat down on an old wooden chair beside the small table, eyes scanning the space around him. It was modest, but clean, every object neatly placed, every family photo on the worn shelf arranged with care and intention. Rick took the glass but didn't drink right away. After a pause, he spoke. "I'm sorry, Monica. I truly didn't know you were working in that building. I never meant to make you feel ashamed or exposed." Monica sat across from him, her eyes not angry, only a little tired, a little wary. "I know, but it was the silence, Rick. That silence made the distance between us feel more real than ever." Rick nodded slowly, eyes steady. "I won't make excuses. I was wrong not to say anything. I didn't know how to respond. I acted like someone afraid of showing what they were feeling, and I regret that more than I can say." Monica exhaled quietly, turning the rim of her glass with her fingers. "I'm not angry with you, Rick. I just don't know if I have the courage to step into your world or to let you into mine. We're different, too different." Rick leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "I'm not here to ask you to choose anything. I just wanted you to know I value what we've shared, however brief it's been. I don't think our differences have to be the reason we walk away from something that might be becoming something meaningful, even if it's only friendship." Monica looked at him for a long moment, then glanced over at the children, now laughing as they shared a cookie side by side on the floor. "Maybe," she said softly, "it's the children who are teaching us how to bridge the gaps. They don't care who has what or who lives where. They just care about how we treat each other." Rick smiled, eyes damp. He stood, placing the waffle box gently on the table. "I'm not asking for forgiveness today, but if there's a next time, I promise I won't stay silent." Monica nodded, and for the first time in days, she smiled. Not politely, not out of habit, but a quiet, slow smile that came from somewhere deep and real. The scent of warm waffles filled the kitchen. The children chattered and laughed nearby. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sun hadn't broken through yet, but inside both Monica and Rick, a small light had begun to stir. Not the blinding light of certainty or grand declarations, but the gentle warmth of hope, just enough to nudge a door open again, 1 inch at a time. That afternoon, when Rick gently invited Monica and Jaden to have dinner at his house over the weekend, Monica hesitated for a moment. She wasn't used to stepping into unfamiliar spaces, let alone accepting invitations from someone like Rick, a man she had once convinced herself belonged to a world entirely apart from hers. But then she caught the eager glint in Jaden's eyes and heard the soft, hopeful whisper of Chloe as she held her hand, and something inside Monica gave way. She nodded. Not because she was ready, but because sometimes life requires us to give ourselves the chance to believe that things can be different. On Saturday evening, Monica wore a soft gray-blue cotton dress and tied her hair back neatly. Jaden put on the white shirt he reserved for special occasions. They stood before Rick's tile-roofed house, warm yellow lights spilling from windows framed by crisp white curtains. When Rick opened the door, a gentle smile spread across his face. Chloe ran out to greet them, throwing her arms around Jaden before pulling him inside, chattering excitedly as she introduced him to every toy in the living room, as if she had been waiting for this day far longer than anyone knew. Monica stepped through the doorway feeling momentarily out of place. The house wasn't large, but it was tidy and inviting, filled with the scent of polished wood and the soft notes of jazz humming from a small speaker in the corner. Rick handed Monica a glass of lemonade, then led her toward the kitchen, where the dinner table had already been set. Nothing extravagant, just a pot of chicken and vegetable soup, a tray of golden toasted bread, and a colorful plate of salad. Monica glanced around, touched by the simplicity, then looked at Rick in mild surprise. He chuckled. "I made this. Chloe's the head sous chef." Chloe came bounding in from the living room, raising her hand proudly. "I washed the carrots and picked out the cucumbers." Monica smiled, the unfamiliarity melting just a little in the warmth of their laughter. Dinner unfolded in an atmosphere of quiet ease and warmth. Monica was cautious at first, but slowly relaxed as she realized Rick wasn't trying to impress or perform. There were no airs, no forced politeness, just stories and shared moments. Rick told the tale of the time Chloe had spilled an entire pot of soup trying to mimic a cooking video. Monica laughed aloud, a full, genuine laugh, the kind she hadn't heard from herself in a long time. Jaden shared that he wanted to be a bridge engineer someday, so his mom wouldn't have to work so much. Rick glanced at Monica then, and in his eyes was a tenderness that went deeper than admiration. "You've raised an incredible boy," he said quietly. Monica looked at her son, then back at Rick, and for a moment her heart was still. She had never imagined herself sitting in a well-lit kitchen, sharing a meal with someone who had once stirred something in her chest she didn't dare name, while two children laughed together as if they'd been siblings their whole lives. She had always assumed happiness was something distant, something too delicate for her hands to hold. But tonight, between the soft clinking of dishes, the light-hearted chatter, and the comfort of presence without performance, she began to believe that maybe happiness was something simpler than she thought. Maybe it was just this, people gathered in a room sharing food and laughter, without walls, without masks, just being together. That evening after dinner, the four of them sat together on the front porch. Chloe and Jaden stretched out on a small mat playing tic-tac-toe with pebbles and bottle caps, their laughter rising and falling like gentle waves. Rick poured more water, and when a cool breeze passed through, he handed Monica a soft folded shawl. Her fingers brushed his as she took it. Neither of them said anything, but the silence wasn't awkward. It was a kind of quiet that spoke of comfort, of something slowly filling the spaces between them without needing to be named. Later that night, as Monica took Jaden's hand and stepped out into the dark, she turned back to look at Rick one last time. He stood under the porch light, hands in his pockets, the warm glow casting soft lines across his face, making him look both familiar and just a little unfamiliar. She didn't make promises. She didn't need to. What she had given herself tonight was something even more fragile, yet far more valuable, a chance. A small act of trust in the idea that maybe the things that truly move us don't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes they come in the form of a simple dinner, an honest glance, a silence filled with truth. And for Monica, that was enough for now to keep her heart open just a little more. By Monday morning, Rick stepped into the boardroom with a mindset far different from any meeting before. The architectural renderings, the cost projections, the marketing strategies for the Riverside housing project, all of it had been laid out, stacked neatly before each member of the board. For weeks, Rick had avoided signing the final approval, postponing with technical delays and demands for further impact reviews. But now every eye in the room was on him. The pressure was unmistakable. One board member spoke first, voice calm but pointed. "This project is a major step forward. We can't keep delaying if we want to attract the new investment fund." Rick nodded slowly, hand resting on the thick folder in front of him, but he didn't open it. Because what filled his thoughts wasn't a profit graph or a zoning layout. It was Monica sitting quietly on his porch, just 2 nights before, her hands wrapped around a glass of water, her eyes lighting up as she watched their 2 children play. It was the scent of soup, the laughter over a modest meal, the silence that no longer separated. He looked around the room, then began to speak. I understand the potential of this project. I understand that raising rents would bring faster returns. But what we're talking about isn't just numbers. These are real people, real families who live there right now, not lines in a report. A few heads turned, some raised eyebrows, but Rick continued. I've walked those streets. I've met some of the tenants. There's an elderly woman living on her pension, a single father raising 2 kids, dozens of others just like them. If we approve this rent increase as it stands, we'll be forcing them out. And we don't have to. We can take a different path, keep rents stable, renovate gradually. We might not see gains overnight, but we'll build something sustainable. And more importantly, we'll stay true to what this company says it stands for. The room quieted. One member older shifted in his seat but said nothing. Another cleared his throat and responded, Rick, I hear what you're saying, but we can't let personal feelings guide business decisions. If emotion starts driving the process, we risk losing focus. Rick leaned forward slightly, calm but clear. I'm not talking about emotion. I'm talking about responsibility. We have the power to choose a direction, and I believe the right direction isn't always the shortest one. Someone else nodded slowly, contemplative. The meeting continued for another half hour. Rick presented an alternate plan cutting down on advertising budgets, proposing a transitional support program for vulnerable tenants who might have to relocate. His voice didn't waver. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Not the weight of a CEO chasing numbers, but of a man who had seen something, felt something, and could no longer pretend he hadn't. That afternoon, as Rick stepped out of the building, he felt lighter than he had in weeks. The early winter breeze was cool, but not harsh. He pulled out his phone and typed a short message. He didn't go into detail about the meeting. He simply wrote that today he made a decision for people like Monica and Jaden. A small decision, but the beginning of something more honest, something more right. Monica read the message while folding clothes. Her hands paused mid-motion. For the first time, she felt that Rick's words weren't just promises or fleeting kindness. They were choices. And to her, that meant more than flowers, more than a warm dinner. Because only when someone is willing to give up what benefits them do you truly know what they value. Rick had done what few in his position would even consider. And for Monica, that was enough to nurture something she had kept dormant for so long. A quiet, tentative flame of trust flickering back to life in a season that had felt cold for far too long. By Friday afternoon, the sky hung low and gray, as if winter was gently tapping on the last rooftops of autumn. Rick stood outside his usual flower shop on the corner, hands tucked into his coat pockets, eyes lingering on a small row of yellow daisies pressed neatly behind the glass. He chose a simple bouquet, nothing loud, nothing elaborate, and drove slowly toward Monica's building. This time he didn't text ahead, not out of impatience, but because some things he felt needed to be spoken face to face, carried in breath, not in pixels. When Monica opened the door, she wore a plain cream sweater, her hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck. The soft aroma of coffee lingered in the air. Rick stood there holding the flowers, and for the first time in years he didn't reach for the perfect words. He simply said gently, "Can I talk to you for a moment?" She nodded and stepped aside. Inside, Jaden and Chloe were playing word tiles on the living room rug. They smiled at Rick when they saw him, but quickly turned back to their game, giving the grown-ups their space without being told. Monica poured a glass of water and joined him at the small table. They sat across from each other. No tension, no rehearsed politeness, just two people who had walked through silence and misunderstanding and still chose to sit down again. Rick placed the bouquet on the table, his hands clenched briefly as if steadying himself. He looked at her, really looked, and then spoke softly. "I don't know exactly when this began. Maybe it was when you split your breakfast at the cafe, or maybe it was when I saw you cleaning floors and still holding your head with quiet strength. But whatever it was, it's only gotten clearer. Monica, I love you. Not because you're strong or because you've raised an amazing son. I love you because you're you. Simply that." Monica didn't respond right away. She studied his face, searching for any trace of pity, any hint of romanticized guilt. But there was none. Only honesty, vulnerability, and a real human flicker of uncertainty. She set her glass down and took a deep breath. "Rick, I've lived most of my life afraid, not of being poor or struggling that I know how to survive, but of hope. I've lost everything before. I've been left alone with a child and a stack of bills I couldn't pay. I built walls not to hide but to last. And now when you say you love me, I'm scared. Not because I don't believe you, but because I've never believed I was someone who could be loved like that." Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes did. Not from weakness, but from the unfamiliar weight of standing at the edge of something soft, something possible. She had lived so long surviving that the idea of simply being held, emotionally tenderly, felt like walking out into light too bright to look at directly. But Rick didn't look away. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, hands still on the table, steady and waiting. Because he knew that sometimes love isn't a declaration. It's a quiet place you make with your presence until the other person is ready to step inside. And that night in a small apartment, warmed by the laughter of two children and the flicker of something real, Monica didn't say, "I love you" in return. But she didn't need to. Because trust, when it starts again, often arrives not in words but in the way someone chooses to stay. Rick stepped closer and sat down beside Monica, his voice softening as he spoke. "You don't have to be anyone else. You don't have to be perfect. I'm not here to rescue you, Monica. I just want to walk beside you if you'll let me." Monica turned to look at him, her eyes beginning to glisten. "You know, the first time I saw you at that coffee shop, I thought you were the kind of man I could never get close to. But now, hearing you say these things, I realize maybe the real distance isn't about money or status, but about whether someone has enough courage to step through their own fear." Rick smiled gently and took her hand in his. "I'm here not to change your life, but to walk through it with you, whether it rains or shines." Monica didn't answer right away, but she didn't pull her hand back either. She allowed herself this fragile moment, letting a man who once hurt her through silence offer a chance at healing through words. Outside the window, rain had begun to fall in a light, steady hush. The little kitchen space felt strangely warm, wrapped in quiet. Monica looked at Rick, lips pressed together before giving way to the faintest smile. "I don't know how ready I am, but I think I can start by learning to trust again." Rick held her hand a little tighter, saying nothing more. Because sometimes love doesn't need promises or bright visions of the future. Sometimes it only needs one person brave enough to speak and another brave enough to listen. And for them in that moment, that was enough. A few weeks after that evening, when Rick opened his heart, Monica received a call from him as she waited for Jaden outside school. His voice on the line was unhurried, simply asking if she could spare some time to see a special place. At first, Monica was a bit puzzled, but then she nodded, a mix of nervousness and quiet anticipation rising in her chest. Rick came to pick her and Jaden up in an old but clean car. Chloe sat in the back seat, holding Jaden close like the two were inseparable. On the ride, Monica didn't ask many questions. She just watched Rick at the wheel, his eyes focused ahead, yet somehow still gentle enough to calm the knots in her stomach. The car stopped in front of a row of two-story cream-white homes tucked into a quiet suburban street. Not luxurious, not grand, but there was something inviting about the place. Each apartment had curtains drawn over its windows. A few windowsills cradled small potted plants, and from somewhere in the distance came the soft laughter of children playing in a backyard. Rick stepped out of the car, turned back to look at Monica, and spoke in a calm, steady tone. "This is one of the housing projects I just finished renovating. Instead of tearing it down like originally planned my team, and I decided to preserve the structure, only fixing what needed repair, and adding a few new units for families looking for a stable place to live." He didn't look at Monica when he said the next words. "One of the units here is available. If you want it, it could be yours and Jaden's." Monica stood still, her breath catching. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't imagined she would one day be standing in front of a place that could be called home without fighting for every dollar of rent or fearing the electric bill at the end of the month. Rick turned to her, his voice even and clear. "This isn't charity, and it's not a gift. You'll pay a fair rent with a proper lease like everyone else. But I'll make sure you have the time and the conditions you need to settle in. No pressure, no threats of being pushed out for profit." Monica looked at him, her hand tightening around the strap of her purse. "I've gotten used to things coming with strings attached." Rick shook his head. "No strings. This isn't pity. I just want to give you a chance to live with dignity in a way that reflects the worth you already have." Monica looked around, the windows softly glowing birdsong drifting from the roof, the faint scent of baked goods curling out from a neighboring unit. Jaden tugged at her sleeve, his eyes wide with hope. "Mom, could we really live here?" Monica bent down to look at her son. Her heart caught in her throat. The day they moved in, the sun was bright and full. Rick didn't come to help. He understood that Monica needed to step into this new life on her own terms. But when she opened the door to the small apartment, she found a basket of fresh fruit waiting on the kitchen counter and a small note resting beside it. Welcome home." Monica read the words, set the paper down, and for the first time in many years, she felt that the place she stood in was no longer temporary, no longer just a stopgap to get her through another day. It was home. Not because someone had given it to her freely, but because she had the right to stay, to build a life on her own terms without fear of being pushed out at any moment. That night, as the soft yellow light spilled through the curtain, Monica sat by the window with a warm cup of tea in her hands, her eyes following Jaden as he read quietly from a book curled up in the brown fabric chair she had just picked up from the second-hand market. The room was still bare in many ways. The walls had no art, the floor no rug, and yet to her it was complete. Chloe had come by that evening too, sleeping on a small mattress beside Jaden's bed. The sound of children's laughter drifted through the apartment, light and genuine. Monica closed her eyes, her heart finally at ease. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she knew that from this moment forward, she no longer had to face life alone. And within her heart, for the first time, there was room for something she hadn't felt in years: hope, because now she had a second home, a place to begin again, and she would not be starting over alone. On Sunday morning, the sky was an unusually clear blue after a night of gentle rain. The first rays of sunlight slipped through thin streaks of cloud, spilling softly across the wooden bench outside the Bluebird Café. Rick pulled up in front of the shop and turned to glance at Monica beside him, offering her a quiet smile. Jaden and Chloe sat in the back seat, taking turns guessing which pastry they would get to try first. No one said it aloud, but they all felt it. There was something special about this morning. They were going back to where it all began. Monica stepped out of the car and tilted her head back slightly, taking in the familiar blue sign overhead. She hadn't imagined she would return to this place one day, not with the guarded eyes of a stranger, but with the warmth of someone coming home. The door swung open, and the little bell above it rang out like a gentle melody of welcome. The cafe smelled just as it always had, of roasted coffee and something sweet baking in the back. Soft music played from the far corner, and the regulars sat in their usual seats, speaking in voices that filled the room with a kind of kindness that couldn't be faked. Rick pulled out a chair for Monica before turning to Chloe. "What would you like to order, sweetheart?" Chloe looked around, then turned to Jaden. "You go first today." Jaden straightened up, smiled, and spoke clearly to the server approaching their table. "2 plates of crispy waffles, 1 hot cocoa, and 1 orange juice, please." Rick looked at the boy surprised, then burst out laughing. "You ordered like someone who belongs here." Monica looked at her son, her eyes shining with pride and something softer, more tender. She remembered their first visit to this cafe when she and Jaden shared a single drink between them. Back then, she hadn't thought they would return, and certainly not like this. She never imagined the day would come when her child would sit here, order food like it was already his place, like he belonged. Throughout breakfast, their conversation danced around the little things. Chloe shared about her craft project at school. Jaden talked excitedly about learning to ride a bike for the first time in the new park. Monica listened quietly sometimes, nodding sometimes, offering a soft smile. Rick watched the 3 of them, his eyes calm and full of quiet gratitude. The meal ended with a warm apple tart that they all shared. Monica dabbed her mouth gently with a napkin and looked over at Rick. "You know," she said, "that day I saw you and Chloe sitting here having breakfast, I never imagined that one day I'd be sitting at this table too, no longer feeling like I didn't belong." Rick gave a slow, thoughtful nod. "And he said, that day I saw you walk in with Jaden and order only 1 drink. I never imagined that a small gesture from a child would change the course of my life." Monica was silent for a moment before she spoke softly. "Sometimes everything begins with something so small, like a single drink or a grateful glance." Rick reached across the table and held her hand. There was nothing more to say. The moment spoke for itself. They were 2 people from entirely different worlds, once living lives that never touched. But here, under the morning sun and the hush of soft music, they sat beside one another as if it were the most natural thing in the world. As they stepped out of the cafe, Jaden looked back one last time and said, "I like this place. It feels like the first chapter of my story." Chloe grabbed his hand and cried out, "But now we're in the best chapter." Monica looked at the children, then up at Rick. She didn't say a word. She only smiled. Because there are days when all a person needs is to sit for a while in the very place where it all began to see how far the journey has come. And for her, this morning was proof that every kind act, no matter how small, can carry a person exactly where they were always meant to be. That afternoon, after leaving the Bluebird Café, the four of them didn't head straight home. Instead, they decided to take a slow walk through the old neighborhood. A gentle breeze stirred the trees lining the sidewalks, and leaves scattered across the pavement, as if whispering that winter was quietly on its way. Chloe and Jaden walked ahead, collecting the prettiest leaves they could find to press into a little notebook they had begun calling their autumn journal. Rick and Monica followed behind their steps unhurried, as though each one was helping piece together a memory long left scattered. When they stopped near a stone bench beside the park, Monica sat down, her eyes still following Jaden as he carefully arranged leaves into the shape of a heart. Rick sat beside her, silent for a moment before speaking. "Do you remember that drink from that day?" Monica nodded slowly. "How could I forget? I only had enough for one, and all I wanted was for my child to sit inside just for a moment and feel like every other kid." Rick kept his gaze straight ahead, his voice quiet and measured. "For me, that moment opened an entirely new chapter. I never thought a single drink could make me look so deeply at myself. I'd gotten used to thinking big planning, long-term living in spreadsheets and projections, but I forgot that the smallest things can hold the power to change a life." Monica turned to look at Rick, her eyes softening. "You know," she said quietly, "that day, I almost didn't go in. I stood outside for a long time, unsure if I should step through the door. I was afraid of how people would look at me, afraid my son would notice how different we were. But I went in because Jaden kept staring through the window and said the place looked warm, like something out of a movie. And I thought, just one drink, that's all to give him a beautiful memory." Rick smiled gently. "And you didn't just give your son a beautiful memory. You gave me a chance to change." Monica lowered her head and quietly held Rick's hand, the one resting on the stone bench between them. She said nothing more. But within her, everything became clear. What had begun from lack, from hesitation, from quiet shame, had somehow led to something honest, kind, and lasting. One glass of water, nothing more, but not less either, because from that a meal was shared, a conversation was begun, a relationship was planted, and a home was formed, not just a place to sleep, but a place where the heart had found peace. Rick gently tightened his grip on Monica's hand. "I never imagined I could change so much because of something so small. But the truth is, you and Jaden showed me something I had long forgotten, that sometimes the most meaningful things don't lie in the grand gestures, but in the quiet decision to see another person's pain and not turn away." Monica nodded, her eyes rimmed red, though no tears fell. "I lived for years afraid that no one would truly understand me, or worse, that if they did, they'd walk away. But you stayed. And to me, that means the world." From a short distance, Chloe came running, holding a bright red leaf in her hand. "Dad," she called Jaden, "and I found one shaped like a heart. I think we should press it into our special day journal." Rick bent down and brushed her hair gently back, nodding. "Today really is a special day." Chloe turned to Monica and added, "You know, Miss Monica, I think if you hadn't come into the cafe that day, we might never have met." Monica looked at the little girl, a quiet smile spreading across her face. "You're right. It was just one glass of water, but because of it, I found a whole new life." Rick looked at the two people beside him, one grown, one small, and a quiet emotion swelled in his chest, deep and tender. Life, he thought, does not always need to begin with something grand. Sometimes it begins with a single, unremarkable moment, a small act of sincerity, and from that, everything can change. Just one glass of water. But it became an entire life. That evening, after dropping Chloe off at her grandmother's house for the weekend, Rick drove slowly back toward Monica's new place. The air had turned colder, and dry leaves skimmed low across the road like old memories, not yet ready to settle. He knocked on the door, and when Monica opened it, her face held a hint of surprise. She wore no makeup, her hair was loosely pinned back, and she had on an oversized gray sweater, a book still in her hand from where she had paused mid-sentence. Yet Rick had never seen her look more beautiful. Not a polished beauty, but the kind that came after the storm had passed, the kind that spoke of peace long fought for. Monica invited him in, and they sat down on the old fabric chair by the window, the same spot where Jaden usually curled up to read each afternoon. Rick reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in newspaper. He handed it to her, saying it wasn't anything special. Monica opened it carefully. Inside was a wooden keychain carved with the image of two hands clasped together. Below it, in thin, delicate lettering, were the words, "Not to rescue, but to walk beside." Monica stared at the small item in her palm for a long, quiet moment. Then she set it down on the table and looked at Rick with a steady gaze. "There's something I've never told you," she said. "Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I wasn't sure I had the courage." Rick nodded, listening. Monica spoke slowly, as if each word had been drawn up from a place buried deep inside her. "I once loved someone before Jaden was born. Back then, I truly believed I was cherished, protected. But the moment he found out I was pregnant, he left. I had nothing. I had to leave school, lost my place to live, and from that point on, I had to learn how to do everything on my own. I started believing I wasn't meant to rely on anyone, that if I did, I would only fall harder. So when you came into my life bringing with you a kind of kindness and stability I'd stopped dreaming about, I was scared." Rick didn't interrupt. He simply sat beside her in silence. Monica went on. "I don't need someone to save me from where I've been. I've already learned how to get back up. But I do need someone who will stay when I'm tired, when I can't keep pretending to be strong. I don't need a promise that everything will be perfect. I just need to know that when the strength slips from my voice, when I stop smiling just to make it through the day, that person won't leave." Rick gently took her hand. "I didn't come to change your life. I came because you changed mine just by being as resilient and generous as you are. I don't need someone to protect. I need someone to walk with me through this life, even on the days you feel fragile, even when you say nothing. I'll still be here, not going anywhere." Monica leaned her head on his shoulder, allowing herself for the first time in a long while to exhale fully. For years she had braced herself against the weight of living. But now, hearing Rick speak in words without embellishment, without promises of wealth or forever, only the simple commitment to remain, she knew her heart had finally found a place to rest. Outside, the wind stirred against the window, rustling softly like it was clearing the way for a new season. Monica gently tightened her grip on Rick's hand. She no longer needed to be rescued because she had already saved herself. But now she was ready for someone to walk beside her, not as a hero, but as someone who truly wanted to stay. And for her, that was the greatest gift life could offer. One Friday afternoon, the late sunlight slipped softly through the window of Monica's small apartment. Jaden sat at his desk, eyes focused on a pale blue card he had just finished cutting and gluing together. He turned the paper over several times, then picked up his pen, wrote a few lines, erased them, and began again. Beside him, Chloe leaned in curiously. "What are you working on?" Jaden looked up a bit shy and answered quietly, "I'm writing a thank you card for Uncle Rick." Chloe smiled and tilted her head to read the page. The handwriting was clumsy but neat, each word carefully formed. "Thank you, Uncle Rick, for giving me and my mom a home, for never seeing me as a burden, and for making my mom smile more than before. I don't know if you need to hear this, but to me you're a hero." Chloe rested her chin on her hand, her voice soft. "I think Uncle Rick really needs to hear that. Grown-ups need to be thanked too, just like us." That evening, when Rick came by for dinner, Jaden shyly handed him the card. Rick opened it and read every line slowly. His usually calm eyes grew blurry. He reached out and placed a gentle hand on Jaden's head. "Thank you for trusting me." Jaden looked up at him, his eyes glowing. "It's not because you did something big. It's because you stayed when things were hard. I think my mom is really strong, but I also know she gets sad sometimes and doesn't say it. Since you've been here, she laughs more. I don't need you to do anything huge. I just need you to stay." Rick paused, overcome with a quiet, aching warmth. The things he had done in silence, the choices made not for recognition but out of care, were now reflected back to him through the clear, honest gaze of a child. Monica sat at the table silent through the conversation. She looked at her son, then at Rick, and something rose within her that was both pride and something deeper. Jaden didn't speak often, but when he did, it was as though he said all the things she had never been able to put into, perhaps because she had never quite dared to say her own gratitude out loud. Chloe tugged gently at her mother's sleeve and whispered into her ear, "Mom, I think Jaden's mom is the most amazing person." Monica bent down to look at the little girl, smiling softly. "Why do you think so?" Chloe beamed. Because she never gave up. No matter how hard things were, Jaden's mom stayed with him, kept working, kept smiling. I think anyone who can do that has to be the most amazing person. Monica couldn't help herself. She bent down and wrapped Chloe in a tight hug. And in that embrace, she felt all the years she had carried on her back. All the naps stolen in parked cars, all the sleepless nights, worrying over rent, now gently cradled by the clear, pure words of a child not born to her, but somehow understanding her better than most ever could. That evening's dinner unfolded in a quiet warmth, with nothing elaborate on the table, just a few familiar dishes that Monica had cooked with the gentle peace she now carried in her heart. Chloe and Jaden sat side by side sketching pictures in a shared notebook, while Monica cleared the dishes and Rick stood at the sink washing them in calm rhythm. No one spoke of the future, and no one brought up the past. They simply lived in the present, where even the simplest words of thanks held a weight strong enough to keep people close. And in the heart of each person in that room, though unspoken, there was a shared understanding when a child is brave enough to say thank you. It is not just gratitude, but the quiet recognition that love, real love, has found a place to stay. That Saturday afternoon, Rick's small backyard was livelier than usual. Monica spread a checkered cloth across the table and placed a few wildflowers into an old glass jar, flowers that Jaden and Chloe had gathered during their morning adventure. Rick was crouched near the grill, coaxing the coals to catch looking up now and then, with a grin as the children squabbled cheerfully over who had won their pebble-stacking contest. The air carried the scent of smoke and grilled meat wrapped in the soft hum of music playing from a small speaker by the kitchen door. Nothing was lavish or flawless, but every detail offered something warm, something real. Monica laid a few more plates of fruit on the table, then sat beside Rick. He handed her a chilled glass of lemonade, his eyes meeting hers with a look that felt familiar. Gentle, as if they had known each other far longer than they had. Monica took a sip, then spoke almost to herself, her voice low and steady. I used to think family meant having both parents under one roof with a house of your own and full dinners around a table, that was the only way happiness could look. But today, sitting here, I think maybe I was wrong. Rick said nothing, only looked at her listening. Monica continued, maybe family is simply a place where you get to be yourself, where someone listens, where someone waits for you, where children laugh freely in the sunshine behind the house. Jaden and Chloe came running up, waving small twigs in their hands, breathless with excitement. They shouted that they had finished building their secret house behind the flower bushes. Rick put on a mock-serious face and asked whether adults were allowed. The two kids exchanged a look, then answered in unison, "Only if you pay a candy tax." Monica laughed, her laughter light and clear like a breeze. She no longer felt like an outsider, no longer misplaced in a life built from necessity or patched together out of loneliness. Among these people, she was simply herself, a mother who had once carried the world alone, who had fallen more times than she could count, but never stopped rising. And now, she was no longer alone. The sky darkened faster than expected. Heavy clouds rolled in, and the wind began to stir, rustling the leaves with a restless energy. Monica looked up and said softly, "It might rain soon." Rick stood hurrying inside to grab jackets and towels for the kids. But before he could return, the first drops began to fall, plinking loudly onto the wooden table. Jaden shouted, "It's raining!" Chloe shrieked with laughter, "Run!" All four scrambled to gather plates and cups, arms full of food and half-empty glasses, racing toward the house through the growing downpour. Monica nearly slipped on the wet grass, but Rick caught her just in time, and they both burst into laughter as her soaked hair clung to her cheeks. They made it inside, drenched, but no one complained. Rick fetched towels, Monica turned on the warm water, and the children took turns retelling their rain-dash adventure as though it had been the most thrilling journey in the world. Dinner that evening continued in the kitchen, lit by the soft glow of a single candle and the gentle warmth of a yellow light. Monica sat quietly watching Jaden and Chloe eat with the eager contentment only children seem to know. Her heart overflowed with gratitude, not because everything was perfect, but because in the midst of such ordinary things, she realized she had found something she had long believed was only a dream. Rick placed his hand on the table, gently brushing against hers, saying nothing. His eyes spoke for him. Monica's fingers closed softly around his. She knew this family hadn't come from a long-term plan. It wasn't built on ease or certainty. It was shaped through patience, respect, and above all, honesty. And sometimes, like a sudden downpour, in the late afternoon, the most beautiful things come, not because we are prepared for them, but because we find the courage to open our hearts. In the end, family doesn't have to be perfect, it only has to be real. The next morning, as the first sunlight filtered through the leaves in the front yard, Rick stood at the kitchen window holding a warm cup of coffee, eyes resting on the backyard where raindrops from the night before still clung to the grass and leaves. Inside, Monica chuckled softly at the sounds of Chloe and Jaden competing to retell their dreams from the night. Everything remained simple, gentle, yet filled with quiet meaning. Rick turned to look at Monica as she sliced bread for the children, his gaze lingering just long enough to press her image into memory. He walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. She turned to him with a smile, the kind of smile worn by someone who has walked through storms and now stands quietly in peace, no longer afraid of what loving might cost. Outside, the light grew stronger, scattering across the drops clinging to the leaves, turning them into little prisms of morning crystal. Jaden burst through the back door, shouting in delight at the rainbow arching through the clouds. Chloe followed, taking his hand, both children laughing in the new sunlight. Monica stood beside Rick, resting her head gently on his shoulder, and whispered, "I think I've been waiting for this moment for a long time. Not to see everything turn out perfectly, but just to see my child happy without the weight he never should have had to carry." Rick pulled her a little closer, answering softly, "Tomorrow the sun will rise again, and whether it rains or shines, I'll still be here. No promises, just presence. But that's enough." The story of Rick, Monica, Jaden, and Chloe didn't begin with a miracle. It began with a shared glass of water, a glance full of understanding, a kind gesture made for no other reason than simple compassion. It's a quiet reminder of something deep and true, that in this life you don't have to be perfect to make a difference. You only have to be sincere. From a stranger in a coffee shop, from a gaze across the space between two very different lives, they chose to draw closer, to open their hearts, to stay. And from that choice, they created a home. Not made of wealth or perfection, but built with patience, kindness, and a love that asked for nothing but honesty in return. Maybe in this story we each see some part of ourselves, maybe in the loneliness, in the weariness, or maybe in the quiet miracle of meeting someone who changes how we see the world. So how did you feel listening to this story? Have you ever met someone like Rick or Monica? Have you ever been the one needing just a glass of water at the right time? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts, not just in words, but from the feelings in your heart. And if this story moved you, consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who might need it too. Here at Emotional Echoes, we bring you stories that are simple yet profound, stories that touch the heart and gently open the door to hope. Thank you for spending these last few moments with us. We wish you peace, strength, and joy in life's quiet corners. Until next time, take care, and may you always find comfort in the little things. Goodbye for now.